Imagine standing at the edge of a ballroom that shimmers like something out of a dream. The chandeliers are so bright they turn the night into noon. The gowns are silk and satin, the men are dressed in white tie, and every face in the room is turned toward the door, waiting. And then she walks in. She is not the queen. She will never be the queen. But she might be something more dangerous than that. She is the one everyone actually wants to look at. Princess Margaret Rose of the United Kingdom was, by almost every account, the most glamorous, the most magnetic, the most heartbreaking woman the British royal family ever produced. She was born into a world of absolute privilege, groomed for a life of perfect ceremony, and then quietly, relentlessly, denied every single thing that made her feel alive. She wanted love. They gave her protocol. She wanted freedom. They gave her a title. She wanted to be seen as a woman. They could only ever see her as a crown. And so she spent the better part of 8 decades living in the space between those two things, the woman she was and the role she was handed. And that space, narrow as it looked from the outside, turned out to be wide enough to swallow a life whole. This is not just the story of a princess. It is the story of what happens when a brilliant, passionate, deeply feeling human being is placed inside a gilded cage and told to be grateful for the view. What you're about to hear is the full story, the early years of warmth and innocence. The love that shook the palace, the marriage that promised everything and delivered heartbreak, the decades of loneliness dressed up as glamour, and the quiet, complicated ending of a woman the world never quite knew how to love properly. If you've ever felt like you were living a life that was designed by someone else, you will understand Princess Margaret before this story is finished. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, the kind that goes beneath the headlines and into the actual human being, you might want to stay close to this channel because this is exactly what we do here. Stories about real people, real pain, real legacies. Now, let's begin. Before we go any further into this story, take a moment to consider what it actually means to be born into one of the most powerful families on Earth and still feel, in some deep and inarticulate way, that you do not belong. That is not a story the history books usually tell. It does not fit neatly into the narratives we build around royalty, the ceremony, the legacy, the continuity of throne and crown and institution. But it is, very precisely, the story of Princess Margaret. And it is worth understanding fully, not as a gossip column or a cautionary tale, but as the life of a real human being who happened to be born inside one of the most demanding and unforgiving institutions the modern world has ever produced. She came into the world on a rainy August evening in 1930, 4 years after her sister Elizabeth, and from the very first breath, the world seemed unsure what to do with her. Elizabeth was the heir. Elizabeth was the future. Elizabeth would one day wear the crown. And Margaret was the other one. In royal circles, being the second child is not simply a matter of birth order. It is a kind of permanent condition. It shapes everything, the expectations placed on you, the freedoms allowed to you, the weight of what you are and are not permitted to want. Elizabeth was born into duty. Margaret was born into its shadow. And yet, for a long time, that shadow was not dark. It was warm, actually. The family, King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and their 2 daughters, was by most contemporary accounts genuinely close, almost startlingly so for a royal household. They called themselves Us Four. They had pet names for each other. The king, a man who had never wanted the crown and carried its weight with visible effort, adored both his daughters with an uncomplicated love that was rare in that world. Margaret, from the earliest age, was the spark in that unit. She was funny, sharp, and effortlessly charming. Where Elizabeth was careful and composed, Margaret was electric. She had a gift for mimicry that could make a room collapse in laughter. She had an ear for music that bordered on professional. She could sit down at a piano and play anything she'd heard even once, by memory, with genuine feeling. She devoured books, collected opinions, and spoke them out loud without apology. People who knew her as a child say she was the kind of person who made everything more interesting simply by being present. She lit rooms up. She made jokes land harder. She made music sound better. She was, by nature, a performer not in the calculated way, but in the way of someone who simply cannot contain how fully they are experiencing the world. She was also, even very young, someone who noticed things. She had the gift of the acute observer, the person at the edge of a gathering who clocks everything, files it away, and produces it at exactly the right moment, usually in the form of a devastating impression of whoever had been most pompous in the room. This gift, in time, would make her the most sought-after dinner guest in Britain. In childhood, it simply made her the funniest person at the family table, which in the royal family of the 1930s was perhaps the most radical thing she could have been. And her father loved that about her. King George VI, who struggled so publicly and so painfully with his stutter, who carried the psychological weight of a man thrust into a role he never sought, found something in Margaret's brightness that genuinely lifted him. She could make him laugh. She could tease him gently. She was the child who reached through the formality of his public life and touched the real man underneath. That love was reciprocated completely. Margaret adored her father. She would later say that he was the great love of her life, not in any strange sense, but in the sense of the person who made her feel most herself, most safe, most seen. He saw what was extraordinary about her before the world had a chance to distort it. The years before the war were, by all accounts, the happiest of her life. The family at Royal Lodge in Windsor, at Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands, at Sandringham in Norfolk, these were places where Margaret could be, at least somewhat, simply a child. She rode horses. She staged amateur theatricals. She chased her sister through gardens. She was beloved and she knew it. But the world does not leave childhoods alone for long. In 1936, when Margaret was just 6 years old, something happened that would change the shape of her entire life, though she was too young to understand it at the time. Her uncle, King Edward VII, abdicated the throne for the love of a divorced American woman named Wallis Simpson. And with that single act, romantic, scandalous, and utterly world-altering, Margaret's father became king, her sister became heir, and the quiet, protected life of us four was over forever. The family moved to Buckingham Palace. The weight of empire settled on George VI's shoulders, and the two young princesses, one now a future queen, the other now a princess of the blood, stepped from relative privacy into the permanent glare of public life. Margaret was 6. She would never again be fully private. There is something important in the timing of this. Margaret was old enough to remember what privacy felt like, old enough to register its loss, but too young to process or articulate what had been taken from her. Elizabeth, at 10, had more language for it, more cognitive frame. Margaret absorbed it more sensorially. She felt the change in the atmosphere of the rooms, the different way the adults moved and spoke and looked, without being quite able to name why everything had suddenly become so much heavier. That early, unnamed sense of loss, of something light becoming something serious, of ordinary life giving way to permanent ceremony, may be, in some ways, the root of everything. It is the moment when the world first communicated to Margaret that who she was did not belong entirely to herself. She adapted, as children do. She was educated at home, alongside Elizabeth, learning languages and history and the ceremonies of the court. She excelled at everything related to the arts: piano, painting, theater, poetry. She was considered brighter in certain academic directions than her sister, though that observation was never meant as anything but private. In the royal household, Elizabeth's intelligence was destined for statecraft. Margaret's was destined for what exactly? No one was quite sure. That question, what exactly was Margaret for, would follow her for the rest of her life. During the Second World War, Margaret and Elizabeth remained in Britain while their parents refused to leave London even during the worst of the Blitz. The two princesses were largely kept at Windsor Castle, safe behind its walls while their city burned. Margaret was 9 when the war began, 14 when it ended. The war years were formative in ways that are hard to quantify. She grew up watching her father age under the pressure, watching her country suffer, watching the world discover violence on a scale no one had imagined. And then, in 1945, the war ended. And with its ending came something that no one could have predicted: the emergence of two teenage princesses who were, to the exhausted and hope-starved public, almost impossibly glamorous. Elizabeth was the serious one. Margaret was the one who made you want to know more. She was 15 when the war ended. By 18, she was the most photographed young woman in Britain. The press were fascinated by her. She had dark hair and enormous blue-violet eyes, and a face that was simultaneously aristocratic and approachable. She wore her clothes with a kind of natural confidence that made fashion houses take notice. She smoked with the casual elegance of a film actress. She had opinions about music, about art, about literature, and she expressed them with a directness that people found either refreshing or alarming, depending on who they were. She began attending public engagements, accompanying her parents and her sister to ceremonies and galas and state visits. She performed her duties with grace. No one could fault her on that, but at every event, people noticed something in her. She was not simply fulfilling a role. She was thinking, feeling, wanting. You could see it in her eyes if you looked closely enough. She had also, by this point, developed the taste and the sensibility of someone born to be in the center of cultural life. She knew her Nile coward from her W.H. Auden. She knew jazz from classical, and she had strong views about both. She had attended theater and opera with a seriousness of attention that was unusual for her age and background, and she had formed opinions that she would argue with anyone brave enough to disagree. The artist Augustus John, who painted her portrait, said she was one of the most intelligent people he had ever sat with. The poet John Betjeman adored her. Writers and painters and musicians sought her out, not because of her title, but because she was genuinely worth talking to. And certain people looked very closely indeed. His name was Peter Townsend. He was a Royal Air Force Group captain, a decorated war hero, and one of the most handsome men most people who met him had ever seen. He had been appointed an equerry to King George VI in 1944, meaning he was a personal attendant to the king, part of the royal household, present at family events, present at intimate family gatherings, woven into the daily fabric of palace life. Margaret was 16 when they first became truly aware of each other. He was 29. He was married. He had children. And none of that, as it turned out, prevented what happened next. It is important to understand something about Peter Townsend's personal qualities before judging this story too quickly. He was not simply handsome. He had endured things that made him real. He had flown in the Battle of Britain, which was not a comfortable or distant experience. He had faced mortality in the way that fighter pilots face it, with great frequency and in very small cockpits, and it had given him a quality that men of that era often did not have, a quality of genuine emotional presence and directness. He was not performing masculinity. He was simply in the room with you, paying attention. For Margaret, who spent every moment of her public life surrounded by people who were, to varying degrees, performing deference, performing dignity, performing the intricate dance of royal proximity, someone who simply existed in the room was a revelation. It is also important to understand that the development of their feelings was not sudden or reckless. It was slow and careful, and conducted with as much discretion as two people in a small royal household can manage. They spent years in the same domestic environment, family dinners, country weekends, official trips, before anything that could be called love was acknowledged between them. And during those years, Townsend's marriage ended, not because of Margaret, but because of the fundamental incompatibility he and his wife had lived with for years. By 1952, when the king died and the household changed shape, the feeling between them was undeniable. Margaret was 21. Townsend was 37. And the death of her father had broken something in Margaret that she would never fully repair. It is important to understand the emotional atmosphere of the royal household in those years to understand how a love story like this one could develop. The family was close. Townsend was present constantly. He was charming and gentle and deeply kind, and he treated Margaret not as a ceremonial figure but as a real person, a young woman with wit and depth and feelings that mattered. For Margaret, who had spent her entire conscious life being defined by what she was not the heir, not the queen, not the one with the purpose written into the structure of the world. Being seen as a full human being by someone she respected and admired was intoxicating. They fell in love, slowly, carefully, with enormous discretion at first, and then with increasing difficulty hiding it. There is a moment that biographers often point to, It was 1953, Queen Elizabeth's coronation. The ceremony was over, the pageantry had been performed, and at a small gathering afterward, Margaret was observed reaching out and casually brushing a piece of fluff from Peter Townsend's lapel. It was a tiny gesture, intimate, unconscious. The kind of thing you do with someone whose body you think of as part of your own world. A reporter noticed. The next day, the story was everywhere. By 1953, Townsend's marriage had ended in divorce. He was free, technically. But nothing in the world of the British royal family is ever simple, and Margaret's situation was especially complicated. She was the Queen's sister. She was a senior member of the royal family. And under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, a law that was still very much in force, she could not marry without the sovereign's consent if she was under 25. She was 22. Her sister, Queen Elizabeth II, was now the monarch. The decision about Margaret's future rested, ultimately, with the Crown, and the Crown was not sympathetic. The King had been the great love of her life. He had seen her completely. He had laughed at her jokes when no one else dared. He had let her be herself in a world that was constantly asking her to be something more manageable. And when he was gone, when she stood at his funeral and watched the coffin and understood that the one person who had always made her feel safe in this enormous, demanding, public life was simply gone, the loss was not just grief. It was structural. Something load-bearing had been removed from the architecture of who she was. She turned to Peter Townsend. It is one of the most painful ironies of Margaret's story that the very thing that had shattered her family's privacy in 1936, Edward VII's abdication for a divorced woman, was now being used as the reason why she could not follow her heart. The Church of England, of which the Queen was the supreme governor, did not recognize divorce. A divorced man was not an appropriate match for a princess of the blood. The memories of the abdication crisis were still raw, still poisonous in the minds of the palace establishment. There was also the matter of the Prime Minister. Winston Churchill, still in office in 1953, was firmly opposed. When Churchill was replaced by Anthony Eden, the new Prime Minister was himself a divorced man, which might have softened things. It did not. Eden advised the Queen that marriage would require Margaret to give up her royal title and her civil list income, which was the stipend provided to members of the royal family for their public duties. Parliament, Eden believed, would not approve. The country might not accept it. The institution could not afford another abdication-adjacent crisis so soon after the last one. What all of this amounted to was a slow, systematic closing of every door. Not a single outright no, because the palace was rarely so blunt. Instead, it was the gradual removal of options, the quiet multiplication of obstacles, until what had seemed like a choice revealed itself to be a trap with very elegant furnishings. And so the machinery of the institution closed around Margaret like a fist. Townsend was dispatched, sent to Brussels as an heir attaché, put 300 miles away and out of the picture. Margaret was told to wait. She was told that when she turned 25, she would have more freedom to decide. She held on to that. For 2 years, she held on to it like it was the only solid thing in her world. She was 25 in August 1955. The world waited. The press coverage was extraordinary. By any modern standard, it would count as a media frenzy. Every newspaper, every magazine, every gossip column tracked the story with breathless intensity. Would she choose love? Would she choose duty? Would she throw everything away for a man, the way her uncle had? And then came the moment that defined the rest of her life. In October 1955, after weeks of agonizing consultation, after meeting with the Prime Minister, after speaking with church leaders, after watching the establishment close every door around her, Princess Margaret issued a statement. She would not be marrying Group Captain Peter Townsend. She said, and the words were dignified and heartbreaking and chosen very carefully, that she had been mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth. She had resolved to put these considerations before any others. She was 25 years old, and she had just sacrificed the love of her life on the altar of an institution that, she would later come to feel, never loved her back. The public reaction was enormous. Many people were heartbroken on her behalf. some were moved by her sacrifice. A few were critical of the church and the establishment's rigidity, but almost no one stopped to ask the most important question, which was this: what happens to a person after something like that? And the honest answer, the one that takes courage to say out loud, is this: you do not simply recover. You do not perform the sacrifice and then neatly move forward into the next chapter as though what was asked of you was a small thing. The heart does not function that way. The soul does not function that way. What you gave up leaves a shape behind it, a hollow in the exact dimensions of what you lost, and for the rest of your life you are navigating around that hollow, sometimes without even realizing that is what you are doing. For Margaret, the hollow was wide and deep. And the years that followed her statement were years in which she moved through the world with enormous style and grace and wit and apparent confidence, while carrying inside her something that had not been treated and was not healing. What happens when you do everything right, when you sacrifice everything the institution demands, and then the institution simply moves on, without gratitude, without acknowledgement, without even a moment of recognition that you gave up something real? What happens to all of that feeling, all of that longing, all of that unlived life? In Margaret's case, it went somewhere complicated and dark and glamorous all at once. The late 1950s were, on the surface, a dazzling chapter for her. She was the most eligible woman in Britain. She was young, beautiful, sophisticated, and free, in the technical sense, at least. She moved through London society like a comet, attending parties and gallery openings and private concerts. She was at the center of the most interesting cultural circles of the era. She befriended artists and musicians and writers. She stayed up late. She drank martinis. She danced. And the whole time, underneath all of it, something was broken. Not in a way that showed, necessarily. Not in a way that would ruin a photograph or interrupt a perfectly executed curtsy. But broken nonetheless, in the quiet, internal way of someone who has learned that love, real, personal, chosen love, is not available to them. She met Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1958. He was a photographer, not aristocracy, not military, not the kind of match the palace would have designed. He was creative, unconventional, socially fluid in a way that the royal world rarely permitted. He moved between the aristocracy and the bohemian arts world with equal ease. He was charming and interesting, and crucially, he seemed to genuinely understand something about who Margaret was. There is a version of this story where Tony Armstrong Jones was exactly what Margaret needed: a partner who appreciated her artistic sensibility, her intelligence, her wit. A man who saw her as a woman rather than a title. A marriage built on genuine affinity rather than institutional convenience. And in the early years, it was something like that. They were married in May 1960, the wedding broadcast on television for the first time in royal history, watched by an estimated 300 million people around the world. She wore a simple white gown. She looked, in all the photographs, like someone who had decided to believe in happiness again. There was something else in those wedding photographs too, something less comfortable. She looked, also, like someone who was deciding very hard to believe something. There is a difference between happiness and the determination to be happy, and sometimes a camera catches it even when the person does not show it to anyone in the room. They would have 2 children together, David, born in 1961, and Sarah, born in 1964. And in the photographs from those years, there are moments of what looks like genuine warmth. A family at the table, children in gardens, 2 people who might, in a different universe, have made something that lasted. The trouble was that the universe they actually inhabited was this one. And in this one, the foundation was never quite solid, but the marriage was never quite right. The cracks appeared early, and they appeared for reasons that are both specific to this couple and heartbreakingly universal. Tony was granted the title Earl of Snowdon upon their marriage, which placed him in the orbit of the royal world without fully belonging to it. He was an outsider granted access, which is one of the most psychologically complicated positions a person can occupy. He retained his photography career, which gave him a freedom and an identity that Margaret, for all her privilege, did not have. He could leave. He could go to his studio, his commissions, his world outside the palace. Margaret could not. And Tony was, by numerous accounts of those who knew him well, not an easy person to be married to. He was charming in public and cold in private. He had a talent for the small, cutting remark delivered in a tone just quiet enough that no one else could hear. He had affairs, not immediately, but in time, and not discreetly. And Margaret, for her part, was not passive in the deterioration of the marriage. She could be demanding, imperious, difficult. She had been raised with a complexity of entitlement and deprivation that produced someone who expected deference but craved genuine connection, and those two needs do not always coexist gracefully. They were, in the end, two brilliant, difficult people who wanted things the other could not give. And behind all of it always was the ghost of Peter Townsend. Not in the literal sense, Margaret rarely spoke of him publicly, but in the sense of the unlived life. The marriage she had chosen duty over. The love she had told herself was impossible, and then found that duty, for all its demands, had given her nothing to replace it. In the mid-1960s and into the 1970s, Margaret's public life continued to be a kind of performance of glamour. She was a fixture at the most fashionable events, in the most exclusive rooms. She traveled to Mustique, the private Caribbean island where she had been given a plot of land as a wedding gift, and where she eventually built a villa called Les Jolies Eaux, the Beautiful Waters. Mustique became her sanctuary, out of reach of the palace, of protocol, of the weight of being the queen's sister. On that island, she could wear a swimsuit and sit in the sun and be, briefly, something close to herself. She was also drawn, during this period, into the gravitational field of the London social and artistic elite in ways that were both exhilarating and, for the palace, deeply uncomfortable. She befriended people who made the establishment nervous. She appeared in places the establishment considered unsuitable. She said things the establishment found impolitic. And the press, which had once worshipped her, began to turn. The coverage of Princess Margaret in the late 1960s and through the 1970s is painful to read now. She was mocked for her lifestyle, for her perceived laziness, for her love of parties and late nights. Newspaper columnists questioned the value of the royal funding she received. She was caricatured as the problem princess, the glamorous liability, the one who couldn't be trusted to stay within the lines. What those columns rarely acknowledged was the fundamental cruelty of her situation. She had no defined role. She had been given no purpose. She was too close to the center of power to live a private life, but too far from it to have real responsibility. She was expected to perform royalty without being given the substance of royalty. She was supposed to be dignified and dutiful and grateful, without being given the things that make dignity and duty feel worthwhile. Think about what that means concretely. Elizabeth had the crown, the unambiguous weight and purpose of it, the decisions and the ceremonies, and the sense that every single morning brought obligations that mattered. Margaret had duties too, but they were auxiliary. She opened things. She attended things. She represented the family at events that were not quite important enough for the Queen's diary. She was used as a kind of overflow valve for the monarchy's social obligations, appearing where she was useful and sidelined where she was not. She was also denied the professional outlets that a woman of her gifts would naturally have sought. She could not take a real job. She could not build a public-facing career in any of the arts, despite having genuine talent across several of them. She was a princess, and princesses in mid-20th century Britain were not supposed to be ambitious in the ordinary human sense. They were supposed to be ornamental and available, to perform duty without expressing desire. The drinking, the smoking, the late nights, these were not, as the tabloids seemed to enjoy implying, evidence of some moral failure. They were the survival strategies of a woman with enormous appetites and no legitimate outlet for them. She met Roddy Llewellyn in 1973. He was 17 years younger than her. He was a landscape gardener who moved in artistic circles. He was gentle and sweet, and uncomplicated in ways that the men she had known were not. And Margaret fell for him with a completeness that people who witnessed it found both touching and devastating. Their relationship was, by any rational measure, destined to be temporary. She was in her 40s. He was in his 20s. She was royalty. He was a gardener. The gap between them was not just age. It was the entire architecture of two completely different lives. But for Margaret, Roddy Llewellyn represented something she had been reaching for since Peter Townsend. Someone who saw her not as a role, not as a responsibility, not as a complication, but as a woman worth loving. Their relationship was photographed and published in 1976. A tabloid ran pictures of the two of them on Mustique, clearly intimate, clearly a couple. The coverage was merciless. Margaret was portrayed as a middle-aged woman making a fool of herself. Roddy was dismissed as a young man taking advantage. The Queen was described as embarrassed. The palace was described as furious. What was almost never said, what the tabloids and the columnists and the public commentators seemed constitutionally unable to say, was simply that she was a person who was lonely and had found someone kind, and that there was nothing to be ashamed of in that. She had spent years in a marriage that had made her smaller. She had performed those years with dignity, produced 2 children, maintained the public face of a functioning royal union, and got almost nothing real in return. And now, in the middle of her life, she had found warmth, and the world decided to make a spectacle of it. The cruelty of it is not subtle if you look at it directly. And in the middle of all of it, Margaret and Tony's marriage, which had been held together by nothing more substantial than appearances for years, finally collapsed. They formally separated in 1976. Their divorce was finalized in 1978, the first royal divorce in over 400 years. The milestone was noted with a kind of grim solemnity in the press. It was framed, as most things in Margaret's story were framed, as a failure. She was 46 years old. Her marriage was over. Her children were navigating the particular damage that an unhappy household produces. The man she loved before the marriage had rebuilt his life years ago, had remarried, had become a grandfather. And the man she loved now was younger than her by 17 years, and moving, slowly and inevitably, toward the life that was actually available to him. The 1980s were, in many ways, a quieter decade for Margaret, though not a peaceful one. The noise around her had diminished somewhat. She was no longer the most watched woman in Britain, because Diana had arrived. Princess Diana, young and luminous and tragic in her own way, absorbed the media's attention like a flood absorbs a field. Margaret moved to the edges of the public eye, which was both a relief and its own kind of loss. Margaret and Diana had a relationship that is worth pausing on. In some ways, they were kindred spirits, both women trapped inside an institution that was too rigid for their actual humanity, both women who wanted love and were given ceremony instead, both women whose genuine qualities were flattened by press coverage that preferred caricature to complexity. They understood each other in certain private ways. But Margaret, who had spent decades developing the armor that Diana was still too young and too raw to build, sometimes found Diana's openness uncomfortable in the way that someone who has scarred over finds a fresh wound difficult to look at. She also, it must be said, could be impatient with Diana in the way that people who have survived their own suffering sometimes become impatient with those who wear their suffering more visibly. Margaret had been trained, from birth, to keep things inside. To present a composed face to the world, no matter what was happening behind it. Diana could not always do that, and there were moments when Margaret's sympathy curdled slightly into something more complicated. The two of them were, in a sense, mirror images across 30 years. The same story, differently told. Both ended in heartbreak. Both ended too soon. Because Margaret, whatever she said, whatever she performed, needed to be seen. She was not a person built for obscurity. The same qualities that had made her so vivid in a room, the wit, the presence, the electricity, required an audience. Not to be validated exactly, but to be real. She had grown up in a world where existence was confirmed by ceremony and witness, and the withdrawal of that witnessing left her, in quiet moments, feeling something close to invisible. She still performed her public duties. She still attended engagements, made appearances, fulfilled her role as a senior royal. But the zest had gone out of it. The occasions that once buzzed with her presence now passed through her like water through something worn thin. She continued to go to Mustique. She continued to have friendships that sustained her. She was, until the end, genuinely beloved by the people who knew her well. She was funny, still. Wickedly, beautifully funny, in the way of someone who had used humor for so long as armor that it had become genuine. She could still sit down at a piano and play. She still had opinions about everything and expressed them with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had been listened to all her life. But she was tired. In ways that photographs from that era begin to show, if you know what to look for. The eyes that had once been so vivid, those extraordinary blue-violet eyes that had been described 1,000 times by 1,000 different writers, had a different quality in photographs from her 50s and 60s. They were still beautiful. They were still present. But there was a depth in them that had not been there before, and that depth was not entirely comfortable to look at. She had health problems that accumulated over the years, with the quiet persistence of debts unpaid. The smoking, which she had done heavily for decades, had damaged her lungs in ways that began to be medically apparent in her 60s. She had a stroke in 1998, while on holiday in Mustique. The stroke affected her vision and her mobility. She was found in the villa's pool, scalded by hot water, an accident that was later attributed to the partial blindness the stroke had caused. She recovered, in the limited way that you recover from strokes, which is to say that she continued, but differently. She came back to London and resumed a reduced version of her public life. She appeared at events. She maintained her relationships, but something had shifted in the quality of her presence. She was there, and yet somehow there was less of her available than before. She had another stroke in 2001, and another. Each one left her slightly diminished in ways that were very hard for a woman of her pride and her vitality to accept. She had difficulty walking. Her eyesight grew increasingly poor. The piano, which had been such a constant in her life, the thing she could always return to, the language she spoke best, the activity that asked nothing of her title, became harder to play. She spent the final year of her life in considerable pain and considerable reduction, and people who saw her in those months say she bore it with the particular kind of dignity that has nothing theatrical about it. She was not performing courage. She was simply enduring because that was what remained to be done. She died on the 9th of February, 2002. She was 71 years old. She died as she had lived, in some ways in a hospital, surrounded by family, with the machinery of the royal institution going on around her even in her final hours. The announcement was formal and brief. The flags were lowered. The tributes were measured and correct. And within weeks, the attention of the world had moved on to the health of the Queen Mother, who died just 7 weeks later, and who was mourned with a thoroughness and a warmth that somehow Margaret's death had not quite inspired. Even in death, she was the second one. Even in death, she was overshadowed. But history is patient. And history is doing something interesting with Princess Margaret, now that the decades have softened the tabloid cruelty and allowed people to look more clearly at the actual shape of her life. Part of what has changed is the cultural conversation around women, around desire, around the question of what women are allowed to want and what they are punished for wanting. That conversation, which has accelerated dramatically in the first decades of the 21st century, has retroactively illuminated lives like Margaret's in ways that weren't possible when she was living them. We can see now, with the benefit of both distance and changed perspective, what was being done to her as a system rather than simply a series of individual choices and individual failures. She was not weak. She was not dissolute. She was not careless. She was a woman with specific qualities, great intelligence, enormous emotional depth, a genuine talent for beauty in all its forms, who was placed inside a structure that had been built by and for other purposes, and she was expected to find meaning there anyway. And when she couldn't, when the structure refused to accommodate her actual humanity, she was blamed for the mismatch. This is not an unusual story for women of her era, but it is unusual in the particular details, the particular extremity of what was required of her. She was not asked to give up small things. She was asked to give up the great love of her life, the primary relationship of her young adulthood, the man who represented to her the possibility of being fully seen and fully chosen. And she did it. She performed the sacrifice that was required. And then the institution moved on, and there was no acknowledgement, no gratitude, no softening of the other restrictions that made her life small. What people are seeing, when they look clearly at her life now, is something more complicated and more moving than the caricature ever allowed. They are seeing a woman of genuine, extraordinary gifts who was placed in a situation that made almost no use of those gifts. They are seeing someone who was loved by her father, by Peter Townsend, by Roddy Llewellyn, by the friends who remained loyal across decades, and who struggled all her life to believe that the love was real. Because the institution around her communicated in every possible way that she was not quite valuable enough, not quite important enough, not quite the right one. They are seeing, in short, a woman who deserved more than she got. She deserved more from the palace, which used her dignity and her sacrifice and gave her nothing durable in return. She deserved more from the press, which feasted on her glamour in her youth and her pain in her middle age, and never paused long enough to understand either. She deserved more from the era she was born into, which was not equipped to know what to do with a woman of her intelligence and feeling and fierce individuality, who did not have a throne to justify taking up space. And there is this about Princess Margaret, something that does not often get said clearly enough: she was brave. In a world that demanded conformity at every level, she was openly, persistently, defiantly herself. She smoked when smoking was unbecoming. She loved who she loved when it was inconvenient. She said what she thought when everyone around her was trained to say nothing. She refused to become invisible, even when the world kept trying to make her that. She chose, finally, the wrong marriage, but she chose it with hope, and she stayed in it for 16 years, and she tried. She fell in love with the wrong man at the wrong time, and then fell in love with another wrong man at another wrong time. But she fell with her whole heart, both times, and you cannot say that about everyone. She played the piano until her hands made it difficult. She went to her island in the sun every winter for as long as she could travel. She laughed at dinners that should have been solemn. She wore the clothes and smoked the cigarettes and drank the cocktails and said the things that made everyone nervous, and never, not once in 7 decades, managed to be less than absolutely herself. That is not a small thing. In the world she inhabited, a world where everything was ceremony and performance, and the careful management of appearance, being yourself, fully and without apology, was an act that required more courage than most of the grand gestures she was never permitted to make. Peter Townsend eventually heard of her death from the radio. He was 87 years old, living quietly in France with the wife he had married in 1959. He said very little publicly. He had, by all accounts, carried the memory of what they had been to each other with great care for decades. His wife, Marie-Luce, had known about Margaret. The loss had never been hidden. It had simply been lived around, the way you live around a piece of furniture that cannot be moved. He died in 1995, 7 years before Margaret, so she outlived him. She outlived the great love of her life by 7 years and died in a February that was cold and ordinary, in a hospital in London, far from Mustique and its beautiful waters. There is a photograph that circulates occasionally, taken in the early 1950s, before the world knew what it was looking at. Margaret is in her early 20s. Her hair is dark and perfectly set. She is looking directly at the camera with those extraordinary eyes, and there is something in her expression that is very difficult to name precisely. It is not sadness. It is not joy. It is something more present than either, the look of a person who is fully, completely awake to the moment they are in, and who is perhaps wondering, even then, what all of it is for. That photograph, more than any other, captures what Princess Margaret was. Not the glamour, not the scandal, not the tragedy as the tabloids defined it. Just a woman, fully alive, looking out at a world that was beautiful and complicated, and not entirely hers to navigate as she chose. We look at her now, and we feel things that the people around her, perhaps, were not always able to feel in the moment. We feel tenderness. We feel something almost like recognition. We see ourselves in the gap between who she was and who she was allowed to be, because most of us know what it is to want something the structure of our lives makes difficult or impossible. We know what it is to choose duty over desire and spend years wondering whether we chose correctly. We know what it is to be loved incompletely, to be seen only partially, to be defined by what we are not rather than celebrated for what we are. Princess Margaret was born into the most extraordinary circumstances of privilege, And she spent those circumstances being shaped and limited and dismissed and caricatured and romanticized, and never, not once with real consistency, simply understood. She was more than a princess. She was more than a tragedy. She was more than a scandal. She was a person vivid, difficult, generous, wounded, brilliant, brave, and the world that surrounded her from birth until death was simply not adequate to her. And maybe that is the most honest thing that can be said about her life. Not that it was wasted, not that it was ruined, not even that it was tragic, though it had its share of that. But that it was insufficient, that the world offered her less than she had in her to give, and that she spent 80 years living with the particular specific heartbreak of being more than what the space around you can contain. She sat at pianos in palaces and played music that moved people to tears. She walked into rooms and made them brighter without effort. She loved completely, twice, and was told both times that the love was not appropriate. She performed thousands of duties without complaint and was called lazy. She had opinions and expressed them and was called difficult. She was exactly herself in a world that wanted her to be less, and she paid for it every day of her life. And here, in the quiet of the story's ending, what rises is not the scandals or the failures or the wasted potential or the years of loneliness. What rises is the image of a young woman at a piano in a palace, playing something beautiful in a room that doesn't quite know what to do with her, playing it anyway because the music is in her and it has to go somewhere. That is who she was. That is who she always was. And the question she leaves behind is not whether she made the right choices, or whether the palace was cruel, or whether the press was unfair. The question she leaves behind is simpler and harder than any of those. It is simply, what do we do with the people who burn brighter than the spaces they're given? What do we do when the world is too small for someone? Princess Margaret never found an answer. But the question, at least, deserves to be asked. And perhaps it already is being asked. Every time someone looks at that photograph, those extraordinary eyes, that complicated expression, and feels something they did not expect to feel. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is, finally, exactly what she deserved.